Hello and welcome into another episode of Lockdown Wolves. Today on the show, ESPN's Kevin Pelton backtracked. He didn't backtrack. He's providing an alternate Timberwolves projection after the one we talked about a couple of weeks ago. That was crazy. We'll talk about what that alternate projection is, what both the Pelton projections and ESPN's BPI, the Basketball Power Index, have to say about Minnesota's title chances this year, their win total for the season. Lots of that prediction stuff that's very fun this time of year. Plus, we'll look at the end of the Wolves roster, preview that for the season. It's all coming. Welcome in. You are Locked On Wolves.
You are Locked On Timberwolves, your daily Minnesota Timberwolves podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Hello and welcome to the Locked On Wolves podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. My name is Ben Beecken. I'm the host of Locked On Wolves. Today's episode is sponsored by Gametime. Download the Gametime app, create an account, and use the code LOCKEDONNBA for $20 off your first purchase. Happy Thursday, everybody. We are just a day away from another Timberwolves preseason game. Today, I want to get into some of the additional preseason prediction stuff. We talked a couple of weeks ago about ESPN's Kevin Pelton and his projections that include all of his different models that he puts together. Did not like the Wolves this season. Now it's been tweaked a little post Karl-Anthony Towns trade. It was like right before the trade that we talked about this. And he's also decided to allow for some potential surprises during the season that could tweak each team's projection up or down. So we'll talk about what he said about the Wolves, plus ESPN's BPI, which is a pretty interesting way that they use to predict individual games. That's if you go to ESPN before a game, it has like a percentage chance that somebody has to win before the game. They did that for the season, and the Wolves actually came out really, really nicely when you look at that. And also some notes on the Cat trade there, too. And then we'll talk about the roster toward the end. A big thank you for making Locked On Wolves your first listen every day. Of course, this show is free and available everywhere, including YouTube, as well as all of your favorite audio platforms. You can also watch on the Locked On Sports Minnesota app on both Roku and Amazon Fire TV. All right, so a couple of weeks ago, we talked about Kevin Pelton's projections at ESPN. He had the Wolves at like 42.1 wins or something crazy, 42.2 or something like that. Eighth in the West. Well, post-trade, that went up slightly, went up to 42.7 average wins. And Pelton still has the Wolves at eighth in the Western Conference. Again, this is his projection that includes all of his different models kind of piled together, like the shown projections, real adjusted plus minus. And I've said this before, it compresses everybody's win totals a little bit too much. It's a bit dicey. Like it's got the Celtics at only 52 wins. Last year, it liked the Wolves. This year, it doesn't. And so the West, it lines out Thunder, Memphis, Dallas, third, Sacramento, fourth, Denver, fifth, Phoenix, sixth, Golden State, seventh, and the Wolves, eighth with 42.7 wins. The rest of the West looks about right, although Portland's ahead of Utah, which is weird at the bottom. But that Wolves projection, I gave my reasons why I hated it a couple of weeks ago. I think I think it's skewed, and I'll explain why here in just a moment. An additional reason why I did a couple of weeks ago. If you want to hear my whole rant, it's like maybe exactly 2 weeks ago. It was like last Wednesday or 2 Wednesdays or Thursdays ago, right before the Cat trade. Now, Kevin Pelton has put together a bit of a different look at this. So here's what he says. Pelton says, and this is over at ESPN, it's an insider article. He says, in practice, there are plenty of scenarios that can allow a team to beat its projection, from better health to player improvement to making trades. So let's run through one such outcome for each NBA team and see how it can improve its projection with a twist. Okay? So here's what he's got about the Wolves. This is pretty interesting. His scenario is that the Wolves repeat as the NBA's best defense. His projections, well, actually, I'll just read what he says. He says, the simple explanation for why the Timberwolves' initial projection is so poor is that they're projected ninth in defensive rating after leading the league last season. My projections take in multiple seasons of data, which include 22 and 23, when Minnesota was 10th on defense. Okay, pause. I'm sure he's got factored in there that the roster is not the same as it was 2 years ago. Do you think he has that in there? He probably does. Because if he's going to factor in percentage of minutes, because that to me is the first thing that comes to mind is like, okay, the 22-23 season, D'Angelo Russell played half of that season. So there's no way that should be impacting his shown projections for 2024-25, right? And also multiple seasons of data going back 3 years, they were actually not a bad. They were like 12th or something defensively, but that was the Jared Vanderbilt, Patrick Beverley defense. So like things have changed so drastically, and the Wolves don't even play the same scheme that they did 3 years ago. Now, 2 years ago to last year, pretty similar, although Karl-Anthony Towns only played in 20-some games in 22-23, and Cat played the whole year last year and was a big part of the defense. He's not on the team this year. Now, he goes on to say there was nothing fluky about the way the Wolves defended last season, and adding DiVincenzo likely upgrades their perimeter defense. If we push Minnesota to the top in terms of defensive rating, it could give them an additional 4 wins. Sure enough, he's got them with 46.9 wins if they have the league's best defense. Now, remember, they won 56 games last year, and as I've already said, this exercise on ESPN suppresses everybody's win total. So, like, this has, like, their best case scenario as the best defense gets them to 47 wins. They're not going to be 9 wins worse this year. They're just not. And the next thing I'm going to do is actually, we could jump over there now. Let's dive into the, I'll leave a little more time at the end for the rosters. Let's dive into the BPI thing, because this gives a bit more context as to they're just not going to be 9 games worse. It's just not a thing. So BPI is their basketball power index. It's a I'll call it can a stat be collaborative? What's the word I'm looking for? It's a stat that pulls in a bunch of other stats and tries to predict everything game by game. It doesn't predict injuries, which is fair. And BPI apparently can adjust on the fly, which is why for any given game, like, you know what I'm talking about. If you go to the team preview page or a game preview page, there's like a pie chart with the percentage chance. I think they have it for like all sports. So anyway, so they have the best chance to make the finals and win the title on here. The Timberwolves have the 6th best odds to make the finals, according to BPI, and the 6th best chance to win the title, according to BPI. Boston has almost a 39% chance to make the finals and a 26% chance to win the title, which is nuts. The Thunder are at 24 and 12.5%. Philly's at 22 and 12.5%. Dallas is at 20.5% and 10%. Cleveland is at 12% to make the finals and 6% to win the title. And then it's the Wolves at 11.1% to make the finals and 4.8% to win the title. Now, Cleveland is ahead of the Wolves simply because they're in the Eastern Conference. I'm absolutely sure of that. Well, and Philly for that matter. Again, if Philly stays healthy, if Embiid plays, yeah, it's a different story. But the Wolves being 6th on this list is great. They're behind only OKC and Dallas in the West, ahead of Denver by a spot, ahead of Memphis by 4 spots, ahead of the Suns by 5 spots. So I can buy that. I can buy the 11% to go to the finals and a 5% chance to win the title. Also, funny side note, it says that 12 of the top 18 teams are out West, which means teams like the Suns and Lakers have coin flip chances to even make the playoffs. And then it says right now, Minnesota, Denver, Dallas, and Memphis all have better BPI projections of making the playoffs. If you're surprised that Minnesota, Denver, Dallas, and Memphis all have a better chance of making the playoffs than the Lakers, well, you shouldn't be. That shouldn't surprise you. There's issues if that surprises you. The Suns maybe is a little bit more surprising. I'd probably put the Suns ahead of Memphis sitting here right now, but I would say the Memphis upside, because of Ja and some of the, the upside of their youth, really, I'd probably put them upside-wise ahead of Phoenix. But anyway, I thought that was really fascinating. But I want to get into what BPI says about the Wolves specifically this year, because there's a specific question in here. It says, what do we make of the revamped Knicks and Timberwolves? And I was actually pretty fascinated by this. So I want to dig into that next, and then we'll move on to talking about some of the non-two-way end of the roster guys for the Wolves. We'll do all that here next. Today's episode of Locked On Wolves is brought to us by our friends at Gametime, our title sponsors at Gametime. Gametime has a new feature called Gametime Picks that makes getting tickets for your favorite live events even easier. Gametime Picks filters out the fluff to show you only incredible deals on great seats, so you don't have to waste time searching through thousands of tickets. There's tons of great events to go to out there. We all know that. You can get tickets for every one of those events at Gametime. Gametime Picks means that they'll curate the list for you, make it easier to save more on everything, all the above: live sports, concerts, comedy shows, theater performances, etc. You can also toggle on the all-in pricing feature to see your total up front so that there's no surprise fees at checkout. Again, you have to toggle it on, but it's a great feature so you're not surprised by fees at checkout. You can also get a panoramic view from your seats in the app before you buy your tickets. And Gametime ticket coverage means that your purchase is covered with the most flexible customer service policy in the ticketing industry. Take the guesswork out of buying tickets with Gametime. Download the Gametime app, create an account, and use the code LOCKDOWNNBA for $20 off your first purchase. Terms apply. Again, create an account, redeem the code LOCKDOWNNBA. That's LOCKEDONNBA for $20 off. Download Gametime today. What time is it? Gametime. Okay, so ESPN's BPI asked the question on in this article on ESPN, also an ESPN Insider article. It says, what do we make of the revamped Knicks and Timberwolves? It says, before the trade, the BPI saw a pretty good future for the Knicks with a good chance of being a top 6 seed in the playoffs. Then BPI saw the trade and liked it for Minnesota. Both teams saw their playoff chances increase, but the Wolves' playoff chances went from approximately 65% to 80% in the West, which, by the way, 65% chance for the Wolves to make the playoffs with Cat on the roster, that seems low to me. Goes up to 80. The Knicks went up slightly to only 65% in the East. The Wolves' title chances went from 4% to 5%, whereas the Knicks actually went down from 3% to 1%. The Knicks' high-end future actually doesn't seem so high to the BPI. Which, side note, I didn't mention this earlier. The Knicks are, this actually shocks me, are not in the top 16 for best chance to make the finals. Am I reading this wrong? No, they're not on here at all. For best chance to make the NBA Finals. Number 16 is the Rockets. Number 15 is the Clippers. Number 14 is the Pelicans. There's no Knicks in the top 15 on this list, which is pretty funny. But it's depth. It has to go back to depth. I'll read the rest of this article, and then I'll get into that. Or the rest of this paragraph. It says, the reason for the prediction is the BPI doesn't see Towns as dramatically better than Randle or DiVincenzo. The Wolves got 2 good players who provide a good 4,000 minutes per season, whereas the Knicks got 1 good player who has averaged about 1,700 minutes over the past 5 seasons. So again, they're factoring in likelihood of Cat to potentially get hurt. DiVincenzo has been durable. Randle until last year had been fairly durable in recent seasons. And 2 good players is better than 1 good player. So I think this is interesting. I do think, and I said this after the trade, I think the Knicks' upside went up. I don't think there's any question about that because Cat is a better player than both Randle and DiVincenzo. However, over the course of the regular season, the depth is going to matter more, potentially. And even if the high end isn't there, the ceiling isn't there, which is the argument I've made in the wake of the trade. Like I was said before the trade, I thought the Wolves, I was predicting them around 54 wins for the season is kind of what I've been saying. Not my official prediction yet. And then after the trade, I kind of thought, I think I'm more in the 51, 52 win range. I feel like the floor is roughly the same, but the ceiling came down a little for the Wolves, at least in the regular season. It may be better in the playoffs. And we've talked about that a little in terms of, Randle better against mismatches, Randle better in, being able to stagger Randle and Ant so you get a bit more bench scoring, some more free throw opportunities. Like there's certainly upside to the trade. I was against it. I don't like it. I'd rather have Cat on the Timberwolves. I think their ceiling is higher with him. But it's also potentially a floor raiser. I saw it as a floor kind of staying the same, really compressing potential season results for a relatively healthy Wolves team, bringing the ceiling down. Maybe the floor stays the same or comes up a little. But that's what BPI sees, is a potential floor raiser, which I think is absolutely fascinating. The one other thing that BPI notes is that the Timberwolves are one of a few teams that have a trio of former All-NBA players. Now, the caveat there is one of those guys is it Mike Conley? No, Mike Conley's never been All-NBA. He's been an All-Star once. Oh, I guess it'd be Gobert, Ant, and Julius Randle. Julius Randle was third-team All-NBA a couple years ago. So that's the trio. Dallas, Phoenix, Minnesota, Boston, and Sacramento has 3 All-NBA players. Philly has 4 former All-NBA players, although 2 of them are Andre Drummond and Kyle Lowry, who are well removed from those seasons at this point. And then the Mavericks are I think I mentioned this, are one of the other teams that has 3 All-NBA players. So anyway, fascinating. Go check out the BPI thing. I certainly think that the projections, the initial Pelton projections, there was a miss there, and I've said that. So I feel like it laid it in a better spot here when we look at the likelihood of the Wolves having one of the league's best defenses again. I would be absolutely shocked the Timberwolves defense dropped to 9th. Now, I've talked before about how replacing Kyle Anderson with Joe Ingles and replacing, Jordan McLaughlin / Monte Morris with rookie Rob Dillingham, like there's some incremental steps backwards, quarter steps backwards in terms of the Wolves' defensive capabilities. But their very best defensive players are still on the team. Rudy Gobert, Jaden McDaniels, Anthony Edwards, Nickeil Alexander-Walker, Mike Conley is a team defender. Like that hasn't changed. And you've added a Terrence Shannon Jr. and you've added now DiVincenzo, I think kind of helps, save that a little bit. So I don't know. They may not be the best defense in the league again, but they're not going to be 9th. Like they're just not. I mean, Gobert very rarely has had defenses that are down in that lower top tier in terms of the defenses he's been on in the past. All right. Roster preview stuff. Let's transition into that. We're going to do a little bit more of this, I think, on Friday's show as well. We did two-way players and contract guys on Tuesday's show. Today, I'm going to do kind of the next rung up on the roster for Minnesota, which is the young players who could be on the fringes of the rotation / PJ Dozier. So that's what I'm going to focus on today. I think we'll hit, and this is roughly based on how I would expect playing time to play out. So today, I think PJ Dozier, Leonard Miller, and probably Keita Bates-Diop all fall in this category for me. So I guess Leonard Miller is the only quote unquote younger player on that list. But to me, if I'm looking at their 15-man roster, so taking out two-way guys, etc., like 15 is probably Leonard Miller or PJ Dozier, right? Those are in some order. Those are 14 and 15, and Keita Bates-Diop is kind of that next half rung up before you get into the Garzas and the TJ Shannons and guys like that. So let's start there. Let's start with PJ Dozier. So I talked a little bit about PJ on Tuesday. PJ Dozier is we'll call him a Tim Connelly favorite, right? PJ Dozier was somebody who got his start in Denver, and Tim Connelly has been the reason he's really back in the NBA. I shouldn't say he got his start in Denver. He actually first played for OKC in the NBA. He was actually undrafted. Played a couple games for OKC back in 17-18, played 6 games for Boston in 18-19, started to break into the rotation for Denver prior to COVID, played, I think, a little bit in the bubble for them, played pretty well. The following year coming out of the bubble, out of that first Denver breakthrough in his age 24 season, the 2020-2021 season, he averaged 22 minutes a game, had 6 starts, scored 8 points a game. It was a bit more involved in their rotation before he got hurt. I believe it was an ACL. But he played fairly well for them. And then coming out of that, he didn't play as much the following season, played 16 games for Sacramento 2 years ago. And then last season, he played in Serbia until he ended up back here over the summer playing for the Timberwolves. I believe actually signed a contract with the Iowa Wolves, or they acquired his player rights. And then he ended up playing in Summer League. Oh, that's right. He did play for the Iowa Wolves last year toward the end of the season, actually. I have his stats right here. But just kind of the definition of a fringe NBA player, frankly, especially I think post-injury. And it was actually 2 years ago he played for the Iowa Wolves. I was right about that. It wasn't last year. And 2 years ago, he played okay. He shot close to league average from 3, which is good for him. He was in the 36-37% range that season and averaged over 20 points per game for the Iowa Wolves. He's pretty big. He's essentially a big shooting guard. He's like a 6'6" shooting guard. Good size, solid defender, decent athleticism, solid shooter, okay passer. I think I said this the other day, but just kind of well-rounded. Not great at any one thing. Good size is kind of the biggest thing. Again, had great athleticism initially. I don't know how much of that is. I mean, he's only 26, I think now. So actually, he turns 28 at the end of October, so he's almost 28. So I don't know. He, as a partial guarantee guy, he's got $1 million guaranteed. He's a fringe roster guy in the NBA, and I think he's the guy who's going to get waived. I talked about this on Tuesday. Ultimately, I think he gets cut. Obviously, Tim Connelly likes him, and there could have been some upside there at one point. I just don't know what he does for this team. So he would be the first guy out. He's probably player 16 on this 15-man roster. Unfortunately for him, I just think that's the reality. But again, this is the quality of the roster now. This is a guy who, has played NBA rotation minutes and isn't he's in the prime, physically in his prime. So it speaks to the Wolves roster depth. Next, so putting it, I guess the last thing on Dozier is I just don't think he makes this team, but if he does, he's kind of that last guy. Maybe he gets waived and ends up back in the G League. We'll see. All right, let's talk about Leonard Miller and Keita Bates-Diop next. That's how we'll close out the show today. Today's episode of Locked On Wolves is brought to us by our friends over at FanDuel. Hey, NFL fans, you can start your season with a big return on FanDuel, America's #1 sportsbook. When you get a hunch in the middle of a game, you can check out the latest stats, view live play-by-play, and so much more on the same page where you place your bets. Live betting tonight, Thursday Night Football. Why not? Go check it out. It's really your one-stop shop. We talked about win totals earlier, or I talked about it the other day. The Wolves win total stayed the same after the Towns trade. The Knicks went up slightly. Now's your time to go look at that and get some bets in there. But again, live betting for the NFL, and honestly also for the NBA too. Preseason action, if that's your speed on FanDuel, if you want to get your feet wet a little bit with preseason, that's an option too for you. So go check it out over at FanDuel. You get started with $200 in bonus bets guaranteed when you place your first $5 bet. Again, place a $5 bet, your first $5 bet, you get $200 in bonus bets guaranteed over at FanDuel. Again, that's FanDuel.com. All right, let's close out today's show by talking a little bit about, well, let's start with old friend Keita Bates-Diop. I'm not I'm not actually predicting real minutes or like rotation minutes here. So we'll go there. I think it's likely he's probably ahead of Leonard Miller on this depth chart right now, but we'll start with Keita Bates-Diop. So Bates-Diop, of course, was a second-round pick of the Wolves in 2018. It was the Tom Thibodeau regime. I remember that year coming out of Ohio State. I think he was the Big Ten Player of the Year. And I actually liked him in the first round for the Wolves because I thought he was a plug-and-play, kind of well-rounded NBA player. I thought there was maybe a little bit more scoring there from just a savvy standpoint, the touch he had shooting from everywhere. Ended up sliding all the way toward the end of the second round. The Wolves picked him up then. And he played pretty sparingly his first couple of years. Actually, he ended up getting a little bit more time when there were injuries and stuff. But it was fine. He was a solid NBA player. He ended up getting thrown into that massive trade at the deadline in 2020, like a month before COVID shut down the NBA. The trade that brought D'Lo and Malik Beasley and Juancho Hernan-Gomez, brought all those guys to Minnesota. Bates-Diop was part of the return that went to Denver. So interestingly, Tim Conley orchestrating that deal and bringing him to Denver. He only played 7 games there. Remember, that's he played a bit in the bubble as well. So I think he actually played a little bit in the playoffs in that series, if I'm not. Yeah, he got into 5 playoff games that year in the bubble for Denver. Finished the year there, ended up signing in San Antonio. Wasn't really a part of the rotation in the 2021 season, but then he became like a regular starter, regular rotation guy for 2 seasons in San Antonio, and was okay in 21-22. In the 22-23 season, he actually shot 39% from outside the arc on just over 2 attempts per game, had 10 points, 4 rebounds a game, played pretty well for a bad San Antonio team. The advanced metrics are all pretty kind to what he did. I think a little bit more of a defensive impact than he had offensively, but contributed in every way. Doesn't need the ball in his hands a lot, just kind of a good, solid basketball player. He's, big body, really kind of a swing forward, can play the 3 because he can handle the ball a little bit, can shoot a little bit, can play the 4 because he's a decent rebounder, but not ultra athletic or anything like that. So last year he signed a 2-year deal with Phoenix. He was in the rotation. I mean, Phoenix was one of the shallowest teams in the league. He was part of a deadline deal, went to Brooklyn and barely played in Brooklyn to end the season, was traded to the Knicks in the offseason. So now he's in Minnesota with his second tour of duty as a member of the Timberwolves. And all the above I said about him, still, it rings true. Like, he is a nice depth piece that's not going to hurt you when he gets on the court. He's not going to do a whole lot to actively help you. Like, he's not an 8th man on a team with championship aspirations, but he can be your 11th guy. And if somebody misses a couple of games because they're, they tweak something or whatever, they're sick, he can step in and give you 10, 12, 14 solid minutes off the bench. And your team shouldn't skip a beat because he's the right mix of professionalism and can do a little bit of everything. Like, all that stuff together makes him a solid NBA player on a vet minimum contract. And I'd be shocked. I said this the other day. I'd be pretty shocked. Shocked is maybe strong. I'd be really surprised if they cut him and ate money there versus cutting a partial guarantee to PJ Dozier, despite the affinity that Tim Conley has for PJ Dozier. I would imagine, and also Bates-Diop was part of the intro, presser last week or whatever. So I would imagine KBD sticks around. He's not going to be in the rotation regularly, but he's a very nice plug-and-play depth piece to have on your bench because he's so well-rounded and can do a little bit of everything. So good for Keita Bates-Diop for finding his way out of the Brooklyn Nets and onto a team with championship aspirations here back in Minnesota. All right, the last player to talk about would be Leonard Miller. Of course, Leonard Miller, coming out of the draft a couple of years ago, he was actually in some ways similar to Jalen Clark in terms of a potential lottery talent that was ultimately drafted in the second round for different reasons, of course. Jalen Clark had the torn ACL, or excuse me, Achilles. So like it's different than that, right? But the lottery talent was there. Remember, he played for G League Ignite, did not play in college in the NBA. The way I described him, college in the NBA, college in the NCAA, whatever, that's redundant. He didn't play NCAA basketball. He played for G League Ignite. What I said when the Wolves ended up with Leonard Miller was that he was a slightly bigger, much rawer version of Jared Vanderbilt. And remember, Jared Vanderbilt was a one and done college player out of Kentucky when he was drafted initially by Denver. The Wolves then traded for him. It's a similar deal. Leonard Miller's at least an inch taller, has an inch longer wingspan. He's more fluid in the open floor. Vando actually can handle better than people give him credit for, but Leonard Miller looks the part in terms of like real fluidity, comfortability with the ball in his hands, active on the glass, not quite as good of a rebounder as Jared Vanderbilt. And also the bigger issue for him would be defense. Like Vanderbilt's a plus defender overall. He's okay in space for his size. Leonard Miller's not. There's not consistency there. He still hasn't built a ton of additional muscle strength. That was one of the issues for him coming into the league, or one of the concerns, I should say. Like, hey, will he be able to put on muscle and add strength to his frame and be impactful at the NBA level with having a bit of a slight frame? And well, he's 6'10" with 7'2" wingspan. He's not. He doesn't quite have the body to be an NBA center. He's really more of a point forward type player. But he could do a lot of different things offensively. Like I think he could play as a center in the dunker spot. I think he could be I don't think he's a great screener, but I think he could be a pretty good roller. I think he could be a good cutter from the wing. Certainly more upside offensively. I'll bring back the Jared Vanderbilt comparison. Certainly more upside offensively. He's got much better touch, can actually shoot the ball. Obviously he can shoot threes. Very natural, good feel. And there's just some like, maturity type stuff, that I think we've heard, out there with how, like the team may have concerns is maybe the wrong word, but there's the team has to feel more comfortable with Leonard Miller's maturity level and what he's going to be able to handle at the NBA level. For a team that's got championship aspirations. He hasn't shot the ball nearly as well in the G League as I think we'd have liked to have seen. He was 38% from three last year in the regular season, but in Showcase Cup play the last couple of years, that has not been as good. I think there's a little more polish needed there in the G League. Although I will say his G League Ignite year to his Iowa Wolves year, there was clear improvement overall. The question is, does the team value him sitting on the bench and getting reps in practice and shoot around and being present for the Timberwolves, for the big club there? Or is it more valuable for him to get reps? It's like in baseball, where do you want the prospect to sit on the bench and only get 5 at-bats a week, or go play every day in AAA? Last year, the answer was obviously go play every day in AAA, or go play every day in the G League. This year, I don't know. I mean, is it going to be phasing him a little bit more into being on the bench so he's with the big club and they can get a feel for him and he can get a feel for what it's like to be an NBA player and be a part of something like that? The upside is clearly still there, but the Wolves also clearly didn't feel like, hey, he could be part of a rotation this year. So I'm very curious to see how things play out with Leonard Miller. He's not, like I'd said kind of offhandedly in the offseason a couple of times, could he compete for some 10th man minutes with Josh Minot and Terrence Shannon Jr.? Now with Keita Bates-Diop in the mix and with DiVincenzo, he gets bumped down at least a spot and a half on the depth chart. I don't think there's any scenario in which he plays rotation minutes this year unless they're just hit with a rash of injuries, which would be horrible for a lot of reasons. But I mean, Leonard Miller's a second-round pick, signed a partially guaranteed deal. So like this year is guaranteed. Next year's a partial guarantee, and then it becomes a club option for him on 26-27 is the deal he signed. So if things don't go great, he doesn't progress this year, he could be traded or he could be let go with the partial guarantee next season. But my guess is that there's enough upside there. Either he's a trade chip, along with a second rounder for somebody else to try and match salaries, free up a roster spot. There is some upside, obviously, because he's still just 21, or he sticks around and they find a way to, to get him, or figure out what to do here a little over a year from now with Leonard Miller. But I'm still very intrigued by what he could become. I just don't know that we're going to see him much on the floor for this team this season. All right, that's all we have for you today. Next, when we go through player previews, we're going to talk Luka Garza. We're going to talk Josh Minot. We're going to talk Terrence Shannon Jr. That's next up as we start to get toward the back part of the Timberwolves rotation. We'll do that on Friday's show. We'll get you ready for Friday night's preseason game as well. Big thank you for making Locked On Wolves your first listen every single day. Of course, this show is free and available everywhere. That includes YouTube as well as all of your favorite audio platforms. Wherever you like to listen to podcasts, you can find Locked On Wolves. You can also watch on the Locked On Sports Minnesota app on Roku and Amazon Fire TV. And you can follow on X at Locked On T-Wolves and also at Beecken with 2 B's, 2 E's, C-K-E-N. Of course, the Locked On Wolves podcast is part of the Locked On Podcast Network. Remember, the Locked On Network is your local experts on all the biggest stories. Once again, I'm Ben Beecken. This is the Locked On Wolves podcast, and we'll catch you next time.